president was clear as the strike started that there was a possibility that you could see U.S. casualties. I don't know that there's an expectation to see them as quickly as we did. The reality is, in the first day, it's easy, that there's a lot of momentum. People are very excited. The longer the war continues and the more casualties that happen on the US side, the harder it is going to be for Trump to maintain the support, even if some of the Republicans in Congress and Republicans across the country, and certainly some independents. The reality is the president didn't prepare the American people for this war in the same way that President Bush prepared the US for Iraq. Now, in the end, it didn't actually matter. It became an albatross around his neck, the Iraq War did for President Bush. For President Trump, there are some differences. No boots on the ground make it a little easier. You're not going to see the same type of images coming out that you did from the Iraq War. But nevertheless, if you start to see the death toll increasing or just the casualty and injury toll increasing among US soldiers, you're going to get a lot of people, especially within the MAGA movement, who fundamentally have not been nearly as supportive of this type of foreign adventurism in the Middle East and thought President Trump had promised during the campaign not to do it. I think there's been some surprise, including by me, about how aggressive Iran has been in attacking what is U.S. personnel and assets in the Gulf states, but still then also civilian infrastructure, civilian entities in those countries. If you add to it pressures from oil and a spike in oil, it makes it much, much more challenging. There's a number of differences between the 12-day war and where we are today. But the two that are, I think, most prominent in driving the situation are one on the Trump side, the US side, and one on the Iranian side. On the US side, during the 12-day war, it wasn't the US in the lead, it was Israel. And there was a lot of debate about whether the US would even get involved. And so when it did, it made a fundamental decision to do so in a very narrow way, with a very clear goal and a very clear strategy. And that was to diminish the Iranian nuclear program and hit at the targets that Israel would not be able to sufficiently do itself. Now we're seeing a decision to have a much more widespread war with an open-ended result at the end. That, yes, maybe you're looking for regime change, as the president had said, but how you get there is much less clear. Iran's number one priority for this regime has always been about its own survival, more so than taking care of its people, more so than its economy, more so than its capabilities across sectors. Survival is number one. And so what that has meant is in the past, the Iranians didn't feel that they were at risk of survival. Even the targets by the Israelis in June wasn't actually putting the regime at risk. Now it seems like the regime really does feel like its actual survival is in jeopardy. And so because of that, it's taking much more forward-leaning and a much more aggressive stance in terms of how it targets and what it targets. That's meant US deaths, certainly in hope that it will create pressure that the Trump administration will halt this war sooner rather than later. It means targeting Arab states and especially Gulf states in hope that they too will pressure President Trump. Whether or not they end up doing so is yet to be seen. But for the Iranians, it's about creating as much pressure as possible. And so it also wouldn't be a surprise, for instance, to see in the coming days or weeks the Iranians undertake asymmetric attacks, not just cyber attacks that I think it's reasonable to assume are already happening, but terrorist attacks, not in the region per se, but perhaps in South Asia, in Latin America, and of course, Europe. Iran's goal right now for its regime survival is to bide as much time as possible, to elongate this out as much as possible, and to cause as much death and destruction as possible in hopes that together that will form the basis for enough pressure to compel the US to end the war. I think whether or not you get more political pressure or more backing from the American people for this conflict is fundamentally going to be about how it plays out. If casualty numbers remain low ultimately, if the 3 soldiers killed in Kuwait are the only 3 soldiers killed, then it's likely President Trump will be able to sustain the conflict for a fairly good amount of time, certainly weeks, if not months. If we start to see very quickly US casualty numbers ticking up, if we start to see the Iranians having greater and greater success and no real indication that the regime is splintering or factions are forming, or that the US and Israel have sufficiently undermined it, in other words, that in the end of the day, it's still going to remain in place, then I think very quickly you're going to see the American people question what we're doing here, and especially Republicans and independents say, this isn't what President Trump promised.
This operation underway since the early hours of this morning demonstrates an unprecedented level of coordination between the United States and Israel, and that's significant. We saw some coordination last summer during the 12-day war in June, or Operation Midnight Hammer. But I think the planning that has clearly gone into this operation ongoing, as well as the execution of it, shows a very strong alliance between the United States and Israel. And it is a huge gamble. It's a huge gamble for all of the sides involved. There are many unknowns and unknowables in this scenario. It's a gamble for President Trump because there could be significant political costs for him in the tragic event of U.S. casualties. There will be a public backlash against that in the United States. We're already hearing about why Congress hasn't been involved in the decision-making process behind launching this offensive. There's a gamble for Israel. We do not yet have a sense of what damage Iran could do on Israel and its citizens, although thus far it has been limited. And it's a gamble for Iran, certainly. I think many in the Gulf were surprised, taken aback, shocked that Iran struck U.S. targets across the Gulf so quickly in the opening phase of the attack. I think Gulf states, their leadership and people will be disappointed, given that there has been a high level of frenzied activity really across the Gulf to avoid this very scenario. But regardless, I think the Iranian decision to retaliate in the first instance by attacking Gulf states, and they have said, of course, that this is against U.S. targets, it's not against our Gulf neighbors, but we are already seeing that Gulf neighborhoods and urban city centers have been targeted or have been impacted by these attacks. So whatever happens, importantly, Iran will be isolated with severely deteriorated relations with its Arab neighbors in the aftermath of whatever, or however this might end. There is still the risk of escalation if Iran-linked proxy groups mobilize, and by that I mean Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran-linked militia inside Iraq, and importantly, the Yemen-based Houthi movement that has threatened to attack shipping lanes in the Red Sea and has done so in the past. So we know they have some naval capability that could create disruption. There's a huge amount of pressure to step back, to walk this back. But at this current moment, I don't see a diplomatic off-ramp unless the Iranian regime announces that they are not going to retaliate and announce some type of surrender, which I do not see as likely. Between the lines there, implicitly, I think we can read regime change as a desired end state, but with the qualification that it's not the kind of regime change operation that we saw in 2003 during the US-led invasion occupation of Iraq. And I think that is the most, that's the reference point that many analysts and viewers are likely to recall is 2003, that moment under then President Bush, when regime change was declared successful and Saddam was ousted. This operation is different in that the US is very unlikely to put boots on the ground to achieve regime change and to install an alternative government in Tehran. I think what's more likely, and what's been indicated or signaled by both US and Israeli security planners, has been the goal of trying to create the conditions on the ground inside Iran whereby an alternative form of government might emerge, at least for the transition period until Iran achieves some level of stabilization. Broadly speaking, of sufficient demonstration that Iranian military offensive capabilities have been sufficiently degraded to an extent that Iran, the current Islamic regime in Iran, is no longer able to threaten American interests and assets across the Middle East and is no longer in a position to threaten the national security of Israel and its people. How that will be determined remains to be seen. There will be surveillance, there will be intelligence gathering, but it will be very difficult in the thick of war, effectively, to gather verifiable information as to what that looks like.
I think the Iranian regime, by and large, wanted to sort of keep U.S. casualties low. That's been their track record in the past because they wanted to keep this to be Trump's war against Iran, not America's war against Iran. And when you start killing American servicemen, then it quickly becomes America's war. So they are helping perhaps create a case for Donald Trump to stay in this fight longer than he wanted to. Look, to say this is a historic moment for the Islamic Republic is no exaggeration. The man Ali Khamenei, who was just killed by the Israeli-U.S. attack, had been running Iran as the ultimate power broker since 1989. So 37 years. It's a long run for anybody, and certainly in the history of the Islamic Republic, he lasted almost 40 years, in comparison to his predecessor, the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, who lasted only 10 years. So Khamenei, for many Iranians, was the only figure that really politically they had seen as a constant appearance in their lives, and now he's gone. So it's a significant moment in that sense. We know he had thought about names. We know he probably gave some names out that he thought should be on the short list. There is now interim council that will essentially run Iran for now. Will there be a supreme leader that will come out of this interim council? Everything is to be tested. Remember, Iran has only had two succession processes. One in 1989, where there was no war, there was no uprising inside of the country, and there was a political class that could get together and actually figure out who should be the successor to Khomeini back then. None of those things are in place today. There's war, there are people in the streets, and the political class that could have the consensus candidate might not actually be available. So a lot of questions here, and for sure, the Islamic Republic, if it survives this round of conflict, still will be in uncharted territory. There's the formal channels where you kind of go about life and you appoint the next supreme leader. That is done by an entity called the Assembly of Experts, 88 learned clergymen, senior religious figures who come together, kind of similar like the Catholic Church when it appoints the Pope. They get together and they have a vote and they would choose the successor. If there is going to be another supreme leader, then that person would reflect the political interest of the most powerful actors, what's left of this regime, as opposed to being a consensus candidate that comes out of the Assembly of Experts. Because as I said, Assembly of Experts is a rubber stamp entity. It doesn't have independent political power to act. So watch not at Assembly of Experts, watch at, where the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, intelligence and security forces and their leaders, where their kind of interests are going, because that is more likely to tell you what sort of a future they see for themselves, for the country, because that will then reflect what kind of person they might want to throw their weight behind. Best case scenario is that the decapitation strategy that the United States and Israel are pursuing creates such a vacuum at the top that you need really a new set of leaders to come in, a very different set of leaders to come in. Some of them could emerge from what's left of the regime. They would have to link up with the opposition outside the country that seems to have much clearer vision in terms of what a different Iran going forward would look like. the US being in this game really focuses minds, both in terms of those who want to fight for a new Iran and those who want to fight for what's left of the old Iran. So the United States being there will concentrate minds, and that is a big question mark whether President Trump is going to have the appetite, the interest to stay in this project. But if he does, that's one good scenario you can imagine. The country doesn't collapse into anarchy, and the Islamic Republic basically ends as we know it, and a new political order will emerge. They need to, define the parameters of what that new system would be all about, but that's something they can figure out. At very least, I think nobody at this point in such a scenario would want to see another supreme leader or theocracy continuing. What the Gulf states in particular fear is anarchy in Iran. Iran is a country of 92 million people. Let me give you a quick comparison. The indigenous population of the country of Qatar is 250,000 people, roughly. That's a neighborhood in Tehran. Imagine civil war state in Iran. Imagine the flow of migrants, refugees, and all sorts of bad things that could come out of Iran. Imagine what that means for these peaceful societies to Iran's south that are trying to focus on their economic development. So for that reason, they fear instability from their north, from Iran, and they have every right to be fearful, because there are a bunch of people now left in the Iranian regime who are, unless given an off-ramp, might be in the business of seeking revenge. The Gulf states have to play this very carefully. They might have an urge to retaliate. I suspect the best thing for them is to let the US and Israel deal with the military side and stay out of it, and just condemn whatever Iran throws at them in the midst of this war, and hope that it won't last for that long.